The beer was still cold in the glass when Daniel Harris stepped away from his table for the last time. It was August in Phoenix, the kind of night where the desert heat refuses to let go, clinging to your skin even past midnight. Neon lights flickered outside the Maryvale bar, casting broken halos over a nearly empty parking lot. A few friends had already left. The music had died down. But Daniel, 32 years old, quiet, thoughtful, with a bookish smile, lingered just long enough to leave a half-finished beer behind. Imagine stepping out of that bar alone. The night air heavy, your shirt damp with sweat, your footsteps echoing as you cut through shadows. You glance at the streetlights, see them trembling in the hot breeze, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel eyes on your back. Witnesses remembered a tall silhouette trailing Daniel. Not a friend. Not a stranger offering help. Just a shape that followed. One patron swore he heard low voices in the alley, sharp words carried on the night air, then silence swallowing everything. And that was it. Daniel Harris vanished into the darkness as if the desert itself had claimed him. By morning, his bed at home was still neatly made, his wallet untouched, his car missing. His phone went dead just after midnight. For his sister Laura and the Harris family, that silence would stretch into years of unanswered questions. For Phoenix, it would become one of the city's most haunting mysteries, an entry carved deep into the cold case files. But tonight, we're going back to that parking lot. To the heat, the shadows, and the last moments anyone saw Daniel alive. Subscribe now so you never miss when cold case files like this finally reveal the truth. Daniel Harris wasn't the kind of man people expected to make headlines. At 32, he lived a quiet, ordinary life in Phoenix's Maryvale neighborhood. He was tall, about 6'2", but carried himself with a calm gentleness that softened his presence. Friends described him as the guy who would hold the door open at the grocery store, the one who'd smile politely but never linger in conversations too long. He had no criminal record, no debts hanging over him, and no enemies anyone could name. On the surface, Daniel was unremarkable, another working man trying to get through the grind of desert summers. Yet it was precisely this ordinary profile that made his sudden disappearance so chilling. On the night of August 15th, 2010, Daniel joined a few close friends at the Maryvale bar, a weathered spot with neon beer signs buzzing faintly in the windows. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Phoenix nights are heavy, the kind of heat that doesn't cool even at midnight, and that night the bar felt like a refuge, cheap beer, buzzing conversation, and ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. Daniel looked comfortable enough. He leaned against the counter, nodding along to a friend's joke, sipping at his cold bottle. A server remembered he smiled softly as he moved aside to let another patron order. Nothing about him suggested trouble. But beneath that easy smile, Daniel carried something quieter. Friends would later admit he had seemed distant at times, checking his phone, staring at the screen as if waiting for a message that never came. It wasn't unusual. Everyone drifts into their own world at bars, but looking back, those glances carried the weight of loneliness. A loneliness Daniel rarely shared, tucked away behind polite gestures. As the clock ticked past midnight, the crowd thinned. Friends said their goodbyes and drifted toward waiting cars. By 12:15 a.m., the Maryvale had nearly emptied. Daniel, true to his nature, didn't make a show of leaving. He simply placed a few bills on the counter, left his beer unfinished, and walked to the door. Surveillance cameras captured his tall frame stepping into the humid night, dark blue shirt damp from the heat, one hand in his pocket. And then the story fractured. Outside, witnesses reported seeing Daniel cross the parking lot alone, his pace quicker than usual. The sodium streetlights painted the asphalt a jaundiced yellow, shadows stretching long and thin in the breeze. At least one smoker on the porch remembered seeing another man, a large silhouette, emerge moments later, trailing behind Daniel at a measured distance. He wasn't close enough to seem like a friend catching up. He wasn't far enough to dismiss as coincidence. He was simply there, watching. Imagine this for yourself. You step into that same lot, the heavy air pressing down, the silence broken only by your footsteps. You feel it. Someone behind you, steady, deliberate. Would you turn around? Would you walk faster? Or would you convince yourself it's nothing, a trick of nerves, and keep moving? That's what makes the last moments of Daniel's life so haunting. Witnesses described hearing low voices, sharp in tone, carried across the empty lot. One said it sounded like an argument, though the words were lost in the desert air. Then came silence. No car doors slamming, no footsteps running, just silence. In the space of minutes, Daniel vanished. By dawn, the alarm began to grow. Daniel's sister Laura was the first to sense something was wrong. He hadn't returned home, and when she called his phone, it rang once before going dead. At his small apartment, the signs were unsettling. The bed was neatly made, untouched from the morning before. A half-eaten pizza box sat on the kitchen counter. His wallet and IDs rested in a drawer, his spare keys untouched. Only his phone and his car, a silver Toyota Camry, were missing. For investigators, this detail was alarming. Adults who leave voluntarily don't abandon their wallet, bank cards, and identification. They take them because they're necessities. Daniel leaving them behind suggested something darker, that his disappearance wasn't planned, but forced. When Laura called Phoenix police, her voice trembled with urgency. "My brother doesn't just disappear," she repeated, almost like a mantra. For the officers, missing adults after a night out were not unusual in a city filled with nightlife temptations. But something in Laura's tone pierced through that routine weariness. She wasn't describing a man who might be sleeping off a hangover. She was describing someone reliable, predictable, and deeply tied to his family. Someone who wouldn't simply walk away. That urgency bought Daniel's case priority. Within hours, officers canvassed the area around the Merry Vale. They swept flashlights across alleys, dumpsters, vacant lots, searching for any trace. They retraced his possible steps, from the bar's parking lot to the nearby streets that led toward the main avenue. But there was nothing. No shoe prints, no signs of a struggle. Just hot asphalt radiating under the desert sun, mocking their efforts with silence. Back at headquarters, investigators pulled the bar's surveillance tapes. Grainy and low resolution, they captured Daniel walking out at 12:15 a.m. A shadow followed 30 feet behind, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, face obscured. For the detectives, this was both a clue and a torment. A figure existed, visible enough to know he was real, but blurred beyond recognition. Was he a stranger? A regular? A random man heading in the same direction? The uncertainty gnawed at them. Witness interviews only deepened the mystery. Some patrons swore Daniel left alone. Nothing unusual. Others remembered the tall man with short hair trailing him, but couldn't give details beyond big and light-colored shirt. A middle-aged smoker recalled hearing angry voices but admitted he brushed it off as bar drama. A younger witness admitted he saw Daniel stop at the exit, exchange a few words with the man, but shrugged it off. This was the cruel reality of human psychology. The bystander effect had played out in real time. People saw something. They heard something. But in the moment, they convinced themselves it wasn't serious enough to act. Minor arguments at bars were common. Who was going to call the police over raised voices in a parking lot? By the time doubt set in, Daniel was already gone. Police also searched nearby businesses. A convenience store across the street had a security camera angled toward the intersection. At 12:18 m, Daniel appeared on the footage, walking quickly, glancing back over his shoulder. Behind him, the same shadowed man appeared, then paused at the corner, deliberately staying out of the light. He stood for several seconds, then slipped out of frame. This was no coincidence. To the investigators, it felt deliberate. Someone was trailing Daniel. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Back at the Harris home, the family's panic mounted. Laura refused to sit still. She drove the streets with flyers hastily printed from her home computer, calling friends, visiting gas stations, begging for anyone who might have seen her brother. Their mother, Evelyn, clutched a framed photo of Daniel at the kitchen table, whispering prayers. Their father, Robert, retreated to the garage where Daniel once worked on cars, polishing his son's old tools as though they could somehow bring him back. For the police, the pressure was immediate. They knew the first 48 hours of a missing person case were critical. Every hour without a trace increased the likelihood that Daniel's case would slide into darker territory. And though no one wanted to admit it, some investigators privately feared the truth. Police feared Daniel's name might end up buried in Phoenix's cold case files if they couldn't act fast. 8. Detectives expanded their search radius, checking convenience stores, gas stations, and traffic cameras on the main roads. But Daniel's silver Toyota Camry never appeared. It was as if both man and machine had evaporated into the desert night. And here's where you have to ask yourself, if you found your brother's phone dead at midnight, how quickly would panic set in? Would you brush it off, tell yourself he'd call tomorrow? Or would you, like Laura, feel the icy grip of dread and know, instantly, that something was wrong? The Harris family knew. They pushed the police harder. Laura's voice on local news stations carried the raw desperation of someone unwilling to be ignored. "He would never leave without telling us," she insisted, tears streaking her face. But, despite their pleas, the trail was already cooling. What happened in those 3 minutes between the bar's door at 12:15 and the last sighting at 12:18 was a black hole. And the desert, vast and indifferent, swallowed the rest. So, we're left with the same chilling question that haunted Phoenix in those early days. What really happened to Daniel Harris in that dark alley? What do you think happened in that alley? Drop your theory in the comments below. By the third day of Daniel Harris's disappearance, the heat in Phoenix was merciless. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees by noon, and the asphalt radiated waves that shimmered like a mirage. Yet the search didn't stop. From the moment Laura Harris reported her brother missing, the Phoenix Police Department had been under pressure, not just from the family, but from a community unsettled by the idea that a man could vanish in the heart of the city. The command center mapped out a plan. Officers divided into groups, canvassing every block within a mile radius of the Maryvale bar. Patrol cars rolled slowly down side streets, their spotlights sweeping over fences, dumpsters, and vacant lots. Volunteers joined in, fanning out with flyers. The bright sheets of paper bearing Daniel's face soon dotted telephone poles, gas station windows, and the doors of corner stores. His smile stared back from every corner, a haunting reminder of the man no one could find. K-9 units were called in. At dawn, handlers led German shepherds across the parking lot where Daniel was last seen. The dogs sniffed at the ground, noses low, tails stiff. For a brief moment, hope flickered. One dog caught a scent and pulled hard toward the alley that led to the main road. Officers followed, weaving through shadows, hearts pounding. The dog tugged forward for nearly 100 meters before stopping abruptly. It circled, whined, then looked up at its handler. The trail had evaporated. Heat, dust, and desert winds had erased what little was left. Helicopters thundered overhead, sweeping beams of light across barren fields west of the city. Pilots leaned into radios, reporting empty stretches of desert, cacti standing like silent sentinels. From above, the city seemed endless, its lights scattered like embers. But from the air, there was no sign of Daniel, no trace of his silver Toyota Camry. Back on the ground, detectives reviewed the grainy security footage again and again. The same image. Daniel leaving at 12. 15, the faint shadow trailing him. 30 feet of distance, a world of mystery. The large man. The reports began to call him. A figure with broad shoulders, short hair, slow but deliberate steps. The image was too poor to reveal a face, yet detailed enough to haunt. He was not a figment. He was real. Someone followed Daniel Harris into the dark. And here is where the question gnaws at you. Would you ignore that faint shadow trailing a man, dismiss it as nothing more than chance? Or would you speak up, call it out, step closer to help? Dozens of witnesses saw pieces of that night. None acted. Each carried the quiet guilt of hindsight, realizing too late that the shadow was no harmless passerby. Inside the precinct, the mood turned heavy. Officers who had rushed into the case with urgency now found themselves drained by heat and frustration. Reports stacked high with no solid leads. Every new interview contradicted the last. Witnesses remembered details differently. One swore Daniel was sober, another insisted he stumbled slightly. One thought the large man wore a white shirt, another remembered gray. The truth blurred under failing memory and fear. A young detective wrote in his log, "We are chasing a ghost in the middle of Phoenix." 8s. For Laura Harris, the days were unbearable. She drove street after street in her aging sedan, windows down, voice hoarse from asking shopkeepers if they'd seen her brother. She stood outside convenience stores handing out flyers until her skin burned red under the Arizona sun. At night, she returned to Daniel's apartment, sitting in the silence, refusing to let hope die. Her desperation was both inspiring and painful. Neighbors described her as relentless. "That girl never stopped," one recalled. "You'd see her posting flyers in the dead of night, tape in one hand, tears in her eyes." It was as if Laura had taken the weight of the entire investigation on her own shoulders, unwilling to let her brother's name fade into the background noise of a city that never slept. Psychologists often speak of ambiguous loss, the torment of not knowing whether someone is alive or dead. It's a grief without closure, a wound that never heals because there is no body to bury, no final goodbye. Laura lived in that state from the first night. She clung to any possibility, any rumor, because the alternative was unbearable. Evelyn Harris, Daniel's mother, handled her pain differently. Frail and aging, she stayed mostly at home, staring at her son's photograph. She spoke little, whispering prayers into the quiet. Sometimes she would murmur aloud, "He must be cold out there somewhere." It broke Laura's heart to hear it, but she couldn't bring herself to correct her mother. Because in truth, she didn't know either. Robert Harris, the father, carried his grief like a weight strapped to his back. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. Instead, he spent long hours in the garage where Daniel once tinkered with cars. He polished old wrenches, cleaned oil-stained rags, and sat on the workbench staring at empty space. For him, the silence said everything. Meanwhile, detectives expanded the search into Glendale, where Daniel often passed on his way home. They visited gas stations, pawn shops, and abandoned warehouses. They collected surveillance tapes, rewound them frame by frame, searching for the missing Camry. Nothing. Not a glimpse. It was as though Daniel and his car had vanished into a void. Community volunteers began to grow discouraged. Searching in the Phoenix heat was punishing. By noon, the air pressed down like a furnace. Dust rose with each step, sticking to sweat-drenched skin. Volunteers trudged through lots, peered into drainage ditches, scoured dry creek beds. But every path ended in disappointment. After a week, many drifted away, unable to endure the endless futility. The police, too, felt the weight. They had deployed everything: ground searches, K-9 units, aerial sweeps, neighborhood canvassing. And yet, they had no evidence, no trace, no breakthrough. A veteran officer admitted to his partner, "It's like the desert swallowed him whole." Eights. This failure gnawed at morale. Detectives prided themselves on cracking cases, on bringing answers to families. But here, every lead dissolved in the heat. Every witness contradicted the last. Every tape showed only fragments. They weren't piecing together a puzzle. They were grasping at smoke. And the shadow of the large man lingered, always just out of reach. The blurry figure who haunted those 3 minutes of footage became a symbol of frustration. They had proof of another presence, but no identity. Was he a random patron? A stalker? Someone Daniel knew? The questions circled endlessly, with no resolution. Laura refused to accept silence. She appeared on local news, clutching Daniel's photo. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "If anyone saw something that night, please, I'm begging you, come forward. My brother wouldn't just leave us." Viewers watched her trembling hands and tear-streaked face, and some picked up the phone. Calls flooded the police hotline, dozens of tips in hours. But one by one, they fizzled. Rumors, false sightings, and cruel pranks. Some said Daniel was hiding from debts. Others claimed he'd crossed into Mexico. One caller insisted he was alive, living under a new name. Each tip was checked, each led nowhere. The family learned to dread the ringing phone. Hope would spark, then collapse again and again. Evelyn grew more silent with each false lead. Robert gritted his teeth in private frustration. Laura broke down only in her journal, writing lines smudged with tears. Every night I call his phone, knowing it won't answer. I don't know what's worse, silence, or the cruel voices pretending to know where he is. Eights. Inside the precinct, detectives argued over theories. Robbery gone wrong, but his wallet was still at home. Voluntary disappearance, but he had no reason to leave. A sudden attack, but where was the body? Each theory hit a wall. One investigator slammed a file shut, muttering, "We're running in circles in a desert of information." Eights. And so, the case grew darker. No car, no body, no trace. It was as though Daniel Harris had walked into the alley and vanished into thin air. The longer Daniel remained missing, the heavier the silence pressed on the Harris home. For Laura, silence was the enemy. She refused to let it settle. Every morning, she drove across Phoenix with stacks of freshly printed flyers, each sheet showing her brother's smiling face above the bold words, "Missing, have you seen Daniel Harris?" The printer at her apartment whirred late into the night, filling the small rooms with the smell of ink and paper. Laura barely slept. She carried tape in her bag, ready to post a flyer on any pole, store window, or bus stop. Sometimes she stopped mid-drive, slamming on the brakes when she spotted an empty wall. Neighbors began to recognize her figure on the streets, determined, exhausted, eyes red from lack of rest. Her campaign painted the city with Daniel's image. It was both powerful and heartbreaking. Passers-by saw the neat smile of a man they didn't know, paired with a plea from a family unraveling. "If we can cover the city with his face," Laura told a reporter once, "then someone, somewhere, will remember something." But as days turned to weeks, the stack of new leads never came. Inside the Harris household, grief took different forms. Evelyn, Daniel's mother, spent long hours by the front window, as if waiting for him to walk up the driveway. Her frail hands trembled on the sill. Each time headlights flickered outside, her heart leapt, then sank again. She whispered prayers under her breath, calling Daniel's name like a mantra, as though repetition could summon him back. To Evelyn, time became a loop. Sunrise, waiting, sunset, still waiting. Robert Harris, the father, buried himself in the garage. The scent of motor oil and grease was everywhere, remnants of the afternoons when Daniel used to work beside him. Robert polished old wrenches, organized sockets, and sat on the workbench staring at tools that would never be used again. For him, the garage was both sanctuary and torment, filled with memories that refused to fade. He rarely spoke, but his silence carried more weight than words. Laura bore the responsibility of keeping everyone moving. She cared for her parents, juggled phone calls with detectives, and pushed the search forward. But her strength came at a cost. In private moments, she wrote in her journal, "I don't know if I'm searching for him or running from the thought of losing him forever." Her handwriting trembled, the ink smudged by tears. While the Harris family lived in suspended grief, the media smelled opportunity. The story of a healthy 32-year-old man vanishing without a trace was irresistible. Local news led with his photograph, grainy footage of the large man, and Laura's desperate pleas. Morning shows replayed the clip of Daniel leaving the bar. Talk radio speculated endlessly. At first, coverage helped. Flyers spread faster, calls flooded in, and police tip lines rang with potential leads. But soon, attention twisted into exploitation. Theories multiplied, each more sensational than the last. Tabloids suggested Daniel had run off with a secret lover. Others implied debts or addiction. Talk show hosts invited body language experts to analyze the blurry footage, spinning wild conclusions from a shadow and a stride. The cruelest blow came from prank calls. Some callers mocked the family directly. One night, Laura answered the phone at 2:00 a.m. A man's voice whispered, "I know where Daniel is, but you'll have to pay to find out." Her hands shook as she slammed the phone down, her chest heaving. False hope had become another weapon, stabbing at the Harris family's already raw wounds. Psychologists call this secondary victimization, when those already traumatized are further harmed by society's reactions. For the Harris family, every rumor and prank felt like salt in a wound that wouldn't close. The emotional toll was immense. Evelyn's health worsened. She lost weight, her body weakened by sleepless nights and endless worry. Robert grew more withdrawn, his quietness deepening into near isolation. Laura felt like she was carrying the weight of 3 lives, each day a battle between hope and despair. Detectives saw the damage too. They knew the case was fragile, teetering between urgent pursuit and inevitable stagnation. The family's desperation fueled them, but results remained absent. Without a body, without a car, without a suspect, the investigation circled the same unanswered questions. And as the case dragged on, the Harris family's deepest fear grew heavier. The Harris family feared Daniel would become another face in the forgotten cold case files. It was a cruel thought, but an honest one. Phoenix had many unsolved disappearances. Names slipped from headlines to archives, from conversation to silence. Laura swore she would never let Daniel's memory fade into that void. But as weeks turned to months, she could feel the weight of inevitability pressing closer. For the community, sympathy began to wane. Stories cycle quickly in a city the size of Phoenix. New headlines replaced old ones. Political scandals, celebrity gossip, crime elsewhere. Daniel's disappearance slid down the page, from the front cover to a small corner, then vanishing entirely. Flyers curled under the desert sun, their edges peeling from tape, ink fading to pale ghosts of the man once smiling. Yet Laura refused to let go. Each night, she appeared on camera, her voice steady even when her eyes were swollen from crying. "If anyone knows anything, I beg you, please come forward." Some in Phoenix grew tired of hearing it. Others admired her tenacity. But Laura didn't care what people thought. She wasn't performing for sympathy. She was fighting for her brother's life, or at least the truth of his death. The media, though, continued its frenzy. Every time Laura appeared, reporters angled cameras to catch her breaking down. Headlines screamed, "Desperate sister won't give up," or "Harris family haunted by silence." What should have been a search for truth became a spectacle. Cameras lingered on Evelyn's frail figure, Laura's shaking hands, Robert's silent eyes. To them, grief was a story. To the family, it was exploitation. In her journal, Laura wrote another line. "I don't know what's worse, losing Daniel or watching the world turn our pain into entertainment." 8. This is where psychology deepens the tragedy. False hope is not just a fleeting feeling. It rewires the brain into cycles of expectation and collapse. Each rumor created a surge of adrenaline, the desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the lead. And every collapse drained their resilience further. Over weeks and months, these cycles eroded the Harris family's strength, leaving them brittle. And you have to ask yourself, if this were your brother, could you endure months of whispers, rumors, and prank calls? Could you carry your parents' grief, fight the police for urgency, and shield your family from cameras, all while facing the possibility you might never know the truth? For Laura, the answer wasn't a choice. It was survival. By the end of that first year, police meetings grew shorter. Reports came back empty. Detectives cycled to new cases, other crimes demanding their attention. Daniel's files still sat on desks, still carried urgency in words, but not in action. Progress slowed. Leads dried up. Silence grew heavier. The Harris family braced themselves. They could see it happening, the slow fade. They knew Daniel's name might join the list of others who vanished and were never found. Their greatest fear was unfolding before their eyes, one unanswered day at a time. If you believe families like Laura's deserve answers, consider sharing this video so their stories aren't forgotten. As the calendar turned, the reality settled like a weight on everyone involved. The case was stalling. Police had reached dead ends. The family's fight kept Daniel's memory alive, but the machinery of justice slowed to a crawl. Flyers yellowed under the desert sun, media attention shifted elsewhere, and Phoenix moved on. Time grinds forward, indifferent. For the Harris family, it wasn't progress. It was erosion, the slow, relentless wearing down of hope. And just when it seemed the silence would consume everything, Another year passed, and the line between hope and despair grew nearly invisible. By the time autumn settled over Phoenix, the urgency of Daniel Harris's case had begun to slip away. The first weeks had been filled with helicopters in the sky, officers pounding pavement, and Laura's face on every local news broadcast. But as months passed, other crimes demanded attention. New emergencies rose. Slowly, quietly, police resources were shifted elsewhere. Inside the precinct, the conversations changed. Detectives who once stayed late revisiting files now sighed and pushed them aside. Reports from the Harris investigation dwindled, each one shorter than the last. No new leads, no further evidence. That phrase became a refrain, typed and signed with weary hands. On the streets, the signs of fading hope were visible too. The bright flyers Laura had plastered across Phoenix began to curl at the edges. Under the desert sun, their colors faded from bold black and white to pale gray ghosts. The tape peeled loose, letting papers flap limply in the hot wind. For residents rushing to work or school, Daniel's face was no longer a mystery demanding attention. It became part of the city's forgotten background. For the Harris family, though, time did not move forward. It pressed down harder, grinding away at their resolve. Meals were a ritual of absence. At the dinner table, Daniel's chair remained in place, untouched, empty. Evelyn sometimes placed a plate in front of it, as though refusing to accept her son's absence. Robert rarely spoke during meals, keeping his eyes fixed on his food or the tools waiting in the garage. Laura sat between them, watching the silent performance of grief play out night after night. In her journal, Laura wrote, "We're living with a ghost. Not the kind that rattles windows or slams doors, but the kind that leaves an empty chair at the table and silence in every corner." 8. The trauma deepened with each passing day. Evelyn's health faltered. She grew thinner, her face pale, her eyes distant. Sometimes she fell asleep in her chair by the window, clutching Daniel's photo like a lifeline. Robert tried to be the pillar, but even his stoicism cracked. He stopped fixing small things around the house, left tools scattered, and sat longer in the garage with the lights off. Laura carried them both, but her own strength was eroding. Behind closed doors, she broke into sobs so violent they left her gasping. And all the while, the world moved on. Headlines shifted to political scandals, celebrity gossip, and sports scores. Daniel Harris's name, once bold on television screens, appeared less and less. Eventually, it vanished entirely. The case that had once gripped Phoenix was now just another unsolved mystery shelved in a filing cabinet. In December 2010, a memo circulated within the Phoenix Police Department. Daniel Harris's disappearance was officially reclassified as a cold case. It was the quietest of endings, no press conference, no formal announcement. Just words on paper that cut like a knife. Case suspended pending new evidence. Limited review only. 8. When Laura learned of the decision, she felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. Cold case didn't mean closure. It meant surrender. It meant the city had decided her brother's life no longer warranted the full force of its pursuit. She drove home from the precinct in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. That night, she wrote in her journal, "We are left with an unfillable void. They have closed the door on him, but how can we? He's still gone." 8. And you have to ask yourself, could you live each day staring at an empty chair, waiting for someone who may never return? Could you keep going when the world told you to give up, when the police closed the file, when even your neighbors stopped asking questions? For most people, the answer would be no. But for the Harris family, There was no choice. Survival meant carrying the weight of absence, day after day. Psychologically, this stage of grief is devastating. Experts call it disenfranchised grief, mourning that isn't recognized by society. The world expects closure, expects families to move on. But without a body, without answers, closure is impossible. The Harris family was trapped in a cycle of waiting, grieving, and being told to accept silence. Each year compounded the pain. By late 2011, the Harris home had grown quieter still. Holiday dinners were reduced to small meals in silence. Daniel's birthday passed with candles lit and then quickly extinguished, as Evelyn whispered prayers over the empty table. Neighbors stopped visiting, unsure of what to say after so much time. Laura carried the burden of speaking for her family at every opportunity, on local radio shows, at church gatherings, even in letters to editors begging for renewed coverage. But the silence from authorities was louder than her voice. The cruelty of a cold case is not just in the unanswered questions. It's in the way life insists on moving forward while the family remains anchored in the past. Flyers disintegrated in the sun. Old news clips vanished from memory. And yet, every morning, Evelyn still sat by the window. Robert still walked to the garage. Laura still printed flyers, even when no one wanted to take them anymore. In 2012, Laura wrote in her journal again, "I fear one day even I will stop believing he's out there. That frightens me more than anything. To lose hope is to lose him twice." Eights. Years blurred together. Police only revisited the file when tips surfaced, most of them false leads that led nowhere. Each time Laura's phone rang with the promise of news, her heart raced, only to collapse again with disappointment. The cruel cycles of hope and despair ground her down. And yet, she never fully surrendered. She spoke at vigils for other missing persons, aligning her brother's story with theirs. "We are not statistics," she told crowds once. "We are families living in a nightmare. We are faces on flyers, waiting for someone to care enough to look again." Eights. Still, behind her brave words, Laura carried exhaustion that never lifted. The years rolled by, 2013, 2014, 2015. Each December, another holiday season passed with Daniel's chair still empty, the house still silent. Evelyn aged faster than her years. Robert grew more stooped, his steps slower. Laura's journal pages filled with the same refrain. "Where are you, Daniel? Why won't the world remember?" Eights. The cruelest part of the cold case designation is the way it erodes memory. Phoenix had moved on. For many, Daniel Harris became just another name. Another statistic. Hit like if you believe no case should ever be allowed to fade into silence. But silence, like the desert itself, seemed endless. And then, 6 years after Daniel vanished, time itself shifted. The calendar flipped to June 2016. Construction workers in Buckeye broke ground for a new water pipeline, their machines clawing into dry desert earth. And buried in that soil, shallow and fragile, lay the secret Phoenix had forgotten. Something was about to change. June 2016. On the outskirts of Buckeye, 30 miles west of Phoenix, the desert stretched in all directions, a barren expanse of scorched earth and thorny brush. The morning sun had already pushed temperatures past 90 degrees, and a construction crew worked under its weight, excavating for a new irrigation pipeline. Their machines bit into the soil with mechanical force, grinding through layers of hardened earth. Then came the sound no one expected. A sickening crack, not of stone, not of metal, but something fragile. The excavator halted. Dust lifted into the air, and as it settled, one worker froze. Staring back from the torn soil was a patch of pale bone. The foreman ordered everything stopped. A hush fell over the site. These men were used to rock, sand, and roots. Not this. Police were called, and within an hour, Buckeye officers surrounded the area, yellow tape fluttering in the desert wind. Soon, Phoenix detectives arrived too, aware of what this might mean. A white forensic tent rose over the pit. Experts moved slowly, carefully brushing away sand with gloved hands and soft tools. Piece by piece, an entire skeleton emerged. Adult male, shallowly buried less than 2 feet below the surface. Some bones bore fractures, deep cracks across the sternum, splintered ribs, and narrow scoring marks. Forensic specialists murmured, "Not decay, not accident." These were wounds from violence. Beside the bones lay the artifacts of a life abruptly ended. A pair of cracked leather boots, soles worn thin from years of use. A rotted leather wallet, emptied of identification. And most telling of all, a silver chain. Its pendant, dulled by sand and time, still carried faint, engraved initials. D.H. Detectives stood silently, the weight of 6 years collapsing into a single moment. One officer whispered words that clung to the air. The desert held him for 6 years, and the desert gave him back. 8. When the news reached the Harris family, the impact was instant and devastating. Laura had lived in the torment of uncertainty for more than half a decade. Hope and despair had battled endlessly inside her. Now, hope lost. The phone call came, and the words pierced her like a blade. "We've found Daniel." 8. Her knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest as though the weight of every sleepless night had landed all at once. Tears poured uncontrollably, not the tears of relief she once imagined, but the shattering sobs of finality. Her mother, Evelyn, sat stunned, staring at the wall, whispering, "At least he's home. My boy is home." Robert retreated to the garage, gripping one of Daniel's old wrenches with trembling hands. The community reacted with shock, too. Many had forgotten, moving on with their lives. But headlines snapped them back. News broadcasts blared. Remains found in Buckeye Desert, identified as Daniel Harris. His photo in the blue shirt appeared again on screens, not as a missing person, but as a victim. After 6 silent years, the case was alive once more. Forensic experts continued their work with precision. The sternum fractures were consistent with a stabbing motion, forceful and direct. The puncture had likely collapsed a lung. This was no accident, no random collapse in the desert. It was homicide. The shallow grave spoke volumes. Hurried, panicked, covered in less than half a meter of soil. The desert winds and rare monsoon rains had slowly eroded that fragile cover until finally, time exposed the truth. The symbolism wasn't lost on investigators. For years, Daniel Harris had been swallowed by silence, his name slipping toward oblivion. But the desert itself refused to keep the secret. By chance or fate, it handed him back. Psychologically, this discovery struck the cold case team in profound ways. For younger officers, it was proof that time does not always bury truth. For veterans, it was a painful reminder of what had been missed in 2010. And for Laura, it was the cruelest form of closure. She once prayed Daniel would walk back through the front door. Instead, what returned was a chain with his initials, a pair of worn boots, and the undeniable certainty of death. The discovery pulled Daniel's name out of the forgotten cold case files and back into headlines, transforming him from a missing man into a homicide victim whose killer still walked free. Reporters swarmed Buckeye, cameras aimed at the white tent, the desert pit, the long line of officers carrying evidence bags. Commentators declared, "The case once thought lost has been reborn." Laura's tearful face appeared on every channel, clutching her brother's photograph outside the family home. Her voice trembled. "We waited 6 years. Now we know. He was taken from us." Eights, but knowing he was gone didn't bring relief. It brought rage. Rage that the killer had lived free for all these years. Rage that Daniel had lain in the desert while investigators insisted the trail was cold. Rage that the family's pain had been sidelined until an accident forced the truth into daylight. Still, amid the grief, something else flickered. Possibility. A murder scene meant evidence. A homicide meant renewed urgency. The cold silence was shattered, and now the law was forced to listen again. At a press conference, a Phoenix police spokesperson declared, "This is no longer a missing person case. This is a homicide investigation." The words struck like thunder. A city that had shrugged and moved on now sat upright, suddenly remembering the man who vanished in the neon-lit heat of 2010. Daniel Harris had been found. And though the desert had claimed him for 6 long years, his case was reborn, demanding answers louder than ever before. The white tent in Buckeye came down, but the evidence traveled across Phoenix, sealed in bags and boxes. Among the boots, the wallet, and the chain, one item stood out: the remnants of Daniel Harris's shirt. Weathered and brittle after 6 years in the desert, the fabric still carried dark stains. Under ultraviolet light, forensic technicians saw what they had hoped for: traces of blood. At first, the assumption was obvious. It must be Daniel's. But when DNA tests came back, the results stopped everyone cold. The blood wasn't his. The revelation shook the room. A trace left behind in that shallow grave didn't belong to the victim. It belonged to someone else. The killer. Detectives knew they were staring at the most valuable piece of evidence in the entire case. This wasn't just a clue. It was a fingerprint written in biology. A drop of blood preserved by chance, carried across 6 years of silence, now demanding to speak. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National Database of Convicted Offenders. Everyone in the unit held their breath as the computer compared it against millions of profiles. Seconds ticked by, then minutes. Finally, the screen delivered its verdict. No match found. Disappointment rippled through the team. CODIS was the gold standard, but it only held the DNA of those already in the system: convicted criminals, arrested offenders. If the man who killed Daniel had never been caught before, his profile wouldn't be there. Some detectives slumped in their chairs. After 6 years, were they back to nothing? But one voice refused defeat. Detective Maria Sanchez, who had taken over the cold case unit, tapped the file gently and said, "This isn't nothing. This is everything. We just haven't found the right door yet." Eights, Maria proposed a new approach, one still controversial in 2016 but gaining ground: genetic genealogy. Instead of looking for the killer directly, scientists could upload the unknown DNA to public databases where ordinary people sent their samples to trace family trees and heritage. Even a distant cousin could lead investigators down a branching path to the suspect. The science was revolutionary. By comparing small fragments of DNA, experts could build a genetic web. From second cousins to great-grandparents, they mapped family trees backward and forward, narrowing thousands of names until one individual fit the time, place, and profile of the crime. The technique had already shaken headlines in other cases. The Golden State Killer, a predator who terrorized California for decades, was identified through genealogy after eluding police for more than 40 years. Other cold cases, rape, murder, disappearances, had been cracked open with nothing more than a single drop of blood or a strand of hair. And now, Phoenix had its chance. Maria explained it carefully to Laura Harris when she visited the station. This isn't instant. It could take months. It may lead nowhere. But it is the best chance we've ever had. A's! Laura listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Hope surged inside her, but she was terrified of it. For 6 years, every lead had collapsed, every headline had faded, every prayer had gone unanswered. She whispered, "I want to believe. I just don't know if I can take another dead end." "Eights," Maria nodded. "Then let me carry that risk. You just keep believing." Eights. And now, imagine this was your family. What if a single drop of blood, something smaller than a raindrop, could solve the mystery that haunted your family for years? Could you live with the waiting, the endless months of uncertainty, knowing the answer might finally be within reach? The lab in Virginia received the sample. Scientists uploaded the DNA into genealogy databases, searching for even the faintest relative. A name here, a cousin there, fragments of family trees spread across the country. They spent weeks, then months, building charts that stretched across walls and computer screens, crisscrossing generations. For Phoenix detectives, it was like watching a map slowly reveal itself. They weren't hunting shadows anymore. They were following bloodlines. In the meantime, investigators pored over Daniel's case files again, this time with renewed drive. They revisited witness statements, compared notes from the night of August 15th, and scoured the blurry footage once more. Every piece mattered, because now there was a real chance to connect the dots. Psychologically, the shift was profound. For years, officers had been haunted by failure, dogs losing the scent, helicopters scanning empty desert, flyers curling under the sun. Now, the lab results gave them direction. Even if it took months, they finally had a road to walk. Maria told her team, "We're no longer chasing ghosts. We're chasing blood." Eights. The Harris family clung to cautious hope. Evelyn, frail but watchful, asked Laura to read her updates from the station. Each time Laura spoke of the DNA, Evelyn nodded slowly, whispering prayers that science would do what human effort could not. Robert returned to the garage, polishing Daniel's tools, whispering to himself, "Maybe this time." Eights, Laura wrote in her journal again. "Hope is dangerous, but I cannot let go. If science can bring my brother's name out of silence, then maybe we can breathe again." Eights. The press caught wind of the development. Headlines read, "Phoenix cold case revived by DNA." For the first time in years, Daniel's story wasn't framed as tragedy. It was framed as possibility. Local stations reminded viewers of other famous breakthroughs. National commentators discussed the power of genealogy to change the justice system. And families across America watching at home felt the same chill. If it could solve this, maybe it could solve theirs. Subscribe now. We cover more cold case files where DNA cracks open decades of silence. Back in Phoenix, months of waiting passed. The detectives received sporadic updates from the lab, promising matches, then dead ends, then new branches of the family tree. At times, it felt endless, but Maria reminded them, "We've waited 6 years. We can wait 6 more months." Eights. Then, one morning, the call came. The lab's voice was calm, but firm. They had traced the DNA to a family line in Arizona, narrowing from distant cousins in Texas to a branch rooted firmly in Phoenix. Among the names, one stood out. A man who had lived blocks from the Maryvale bar in 2010. A man with a violent past, but who had never left DNA in Caudice. A man whose blood had soaked Daniel Harris's shirt on that sweltering night. A name was about to emerge from the shadows. The name that surfaced from the genetic genealogy search was Michael Turner. On paper, he seemed ordinary, mid-40s, working night shifts as a security guard, living in a modest West Phoenix apartment. But his past whispered something darker. Arrests for fights, threats against an ex-girlfriend, repeated firings for aggression on the job. He had never served long sentences, never left DNA in Caudice, but the pattern was there. A man whose temper spiraled, who believed control was his shield. Detective Maria Sanchez and her cold case team knew they couldn't rush. They needed proof so airtight that Turner would never escape through legal cracks. Surveillance began quietly. Unmarked SUVs blended into parking lots. Officers rotated shifts, tracking his movements. The late-night liquor store visits, the long drives into the desert, the solitary routine of a man who thought he was invisible. The break came in the smallest of gestures. Turner stubbed a cigarette into an ashtray outside a bar. Minutes later, an undercover officer posing as a cleaner bagged it. Another day, he tossed a half-empty water bottle into a trash can near his workplace. Both items went straight to the lab. The results returned with precision that no lawyer could dispute. The DNA on those items perfectly matched the blood on Daniel Harris's shirt. Maria gathered her team in the briefing room, the whiteboard filled with timelines, photographs, and red ink connecting dots across 6 years of silence. She spoke firmly. "We have our killer. Now we bring him in." This isn't just an arrest. It's the moment we give the Harris family the truth they've carried in darkness. 8. Psychological profiling painted a chilling portrait. Turner fit the profile of a man who masked volatility under routine. Outwardly quiet, inwardly boiling. His need for control explained his aggression, his quickness to fight, his inability to accept perceived slights. On the night of August 15, 2010, when Daniel walked into that parking lot, he likely crossed paths with Turner's need to dominate. Perhaps a word, a glance, or nothing more than circumstance triggered the violence. Turner's pattern of behavior made the leap to homicide all too plausible. The raid was planned with military precision. SWAT coordinated with the cold case unit. 2 teams positioned themselves before dawn, blending into the stillness of the apartment complex. The desert sky was just beginning to pale when Turner's door creaked open. Dressed in his rumpled gray uniform, coffee cup in hand, he stepped into the early morning air. The radio crackled. "Target leaving!" 8. Engines roared to life. An armored vehicle screeched around the corner. Officers flooded the lot, weapons drawn. "Police! Don't move!" The command cut through the quiet. Turner froze, coffee spilling across the concrete. His eyes darted, wide with panic, as hands grabbed him, slammed him against the wall, cold cuffs snapping into place. Neighbors stirred awake, peering from windows and doorways. Phones appeared, recording shaky footage that would hit social media within hours. The man they waved to each morning, the man who lived quietly among them, was dragged away in chains. Shock rippled through the crowd. One neighbor whispered, "No way. He bought bread from me yesterday." Another muttered, "He always kept to himself." 8. By noon, Phoenix was buzzing. News channels looped the footage of Turner cuffed, head down, flanked by officers. Headlines screamed, "Cold case breakthrough." Suspect arrested in Daniel Harris, murder. Commentators reminded viewers of the years of silence, the endless search, the family's pleas. Turner's name, hidden for years, was now etched in public memory. For years, his identity had been buried in shadows. But cold case files don't forget. The drop of blood on Daniel's shirt, carried across 6 years, had dragged him back into the light. As Turner was booked, he protested loudly. "You've got nothing on me. I didn't do anything." But his shouts were drowned out by the thud of cell doors closing. The DNA was undeniable. The shadow in the blurry footage finally had a name. For the Harris family, the arrest was both relief and heartbreak. Laura wept when she saw the image of Turner in cuffs. "At last, someone will answer for my brother," she whispered. Evelyn sat silent in her chair, staring at Daniel's photo, murmuring, "Finally, justice." Robert walked to the garage, gripped a wrench, and let the tears fall he had held for 6 long years. Comment below. Did justice come too late, or just in time? The arrest was only the beginning. Ahead lay courtrooms, testimony, and the long road of trial. But one thing was certain. Daniel Harris's case was no longer buried in the desert. His killer was in custody. And now, Phoenix prepared to watch justice unfold. The trial of Michael Turner began in the Maricopa County Courthouse, and the building buzzed with anticipation. Lines stretched outside as residents, reporters, and activists crowded in, desperate to witness the end of a case that had haunted Phoenix for years. Inside, every seat was filled. The air was thick with murmurs, tension, and the heavy presence of grief. Laura Harris sat in the front row, clutching a framed photo of her brother. Her mother, Evelyn, frail but resolute, sat beside her. Robert remained steady, his face expressionless but his eyes damp, staring at the man accused of taking his son's life. When Turner entered the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, the atmosphere shifted. Murmurs rippled, some hissing in anger, others whispering disbelief. For 6 years he had lived among them, a ghost in plain sight. Now he sat shackled, trying to hide behind a mask of calm. The prosecution wasted no time. They presented the jury with the silver chain, the worn boots, and most damning of all, the DNA. Experts from Virginia took the stand, projecting charts of sprawling family trees, explaining how genealogy had narrowed thousands of names to one: Michael Turner. Then came the clincher. DNA from his cigarette and water bottle matched the blood on Daniel's shirt. The margin of error? Virtually zero. The defense fought back, arguing that DNA only proved Turner's presence, not murder. But then came the surprise witness. Paul Jenkins, a night shift worker who had stayed silent for years. His voice shook as he recalled seeing Turner arguing with Daniel outside the Maryvale bar. "I saw him shove Daniel's shoulder. I heard Daniel say, 'Leave me alone.' I thought it was just a scuffle, but I've regretted staying quiet ever since." Tss. The courtroom gasped. Laura covered her mouth, tears streaming. Evelyn bowed her head, whispering prayers. The jury leaned forward, visibly shaken by the testimony. Day after day, the trial unfolded, but the narrative became undeniable. Turner's history of violence, the forensic proof, the eyewitness account, all threads wove together into one conclusion. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the room. The 4 persons stood, voice steady but heavy. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Turner, guilty of first-degree murder." "Eights." The words cracked the silence. Laura collapsed into her father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Evelyn closed her eyes, whispering, "Finally." Robert bowed his head, a single tear sliding down his cheek. The judge's sentence was firm: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Turner sat frozen, his face pale, eyes vacant, as the reality of his fate closed in. For years, he had walked free. Now he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Relief, grief, and closure collided in the courtroom. For the Harris family, it was not triumph, it was survival. They had answers, but not their son. They had justice, but not peace. And you have to ask yourself, if it were your brother, would this verdict feel like justice or just survival? Reporters rushed outside, microphones flashing. Headlines erupted. Justice for Daniel Harris. The city exhaled after 12 years of questions. But inside the Harris family's hearts, the wounds remained. As the gavel struck and the trial ended, one chapter closed. Yet another awaited. The courtroom gave way to candles, prayers, and memories. The next time the community gathered, it would not be for justice, but for Daniel's memorial. 12 years after Daniel Harris vanished into the neon-lit night, a small church in Phoenix filled with friends, neighbors, and volunteers who had once searched the desert for him. White flowers lined the altar. A framed photo of Daniel, smiling softly, rested beside the silver chain that once lay buried in sand. Candles flickered, their glow reflecting off tearful faces. Laura stood at the front, voice trembling but firm. We walked 12 long years, 6 with no answers, 6 waiting for justice. Now Daniel has both. My brother will never be forgotten. Her words carried across the pews, settling into the hearts of everyone listening. Evelyn and Robert sat in the front row, holding hands tightly, as if they could finally let some of the weight go. The community that had once let his name fade returned to honor him. It wasn't only a farewell, it was a reminder. Daniel's story had become part of something larger, a testament to how truth survives, even when buried beneath silence. Forensic science had carried that truth forward. A single drop of blood preserved in fabric led to justice when human memory and traditional investigation could not. Persistence by detectives, scientists, and a family who refused to give up had pierced through the darkness. Daniel Harris's case proves why cold case files matter, because truth can surface, even after years in the desert. As the memorial ended, the candles burned low, but their light lingered. Just as Daniel's story will linger, not only as tragedy, but as proof that justice, however delayed, can still be found. Subscribe to our channel and join us for more stories where darkness is pierced by truth.